All right, hello. Welcome to the Art of Renovation Live. I'm your host, Paul Foster from Contact Renovations. This week, we have a bit of a different type of show for us here, which should be a lot of fun. We have Stephanie Krikorian. She's a celebrity ghostwriter and journalist, and I'll let her explain a bit more about what that means. And why is she on the show, you ask? Well, she recently renovated her kitchen in her New York home. And she did have a general contractor, but she was heavily involved in the process. And we found an article that she wrote about her experience. And we really thought that kind of struck home for us as far as good content that would be good to share with not only our potential clients, but with people in general who are considering a project and not really sure how to start. And so Stephanie shared her ups and downs throughout the process, and luckily she's agreed to come on the show with us and share a bit more about it. So before I bring her on, let me introduce Stephanie. So bear with me for a second here. All right. So, oh, look at this. I brought the wrong form. Anyways, there you go. Rookie move by your host. My apologies, Stephanie. But anyhow, so Stephanie, she's a journalist. She's a ghostwriter. She grew up in Canada, out in Ontario, but now she lives out in New York. And, she does a lot of different sorts of writing, and we'll let her explain a bit more about what she does professionally. But, what she's been through within her project is, I think, something that's great to share with the public here. And let's bring her on the show, and we'll get into it in more detail here. So, Stephanie, I'll pull you on. Bear with me. All right. Hey, Stephanie.
Hi, how are you?
Good, thanks. Thanks for coming on. Sorry about not bringing the cheat sheet for your bio, but it was pretty succinct to start with. So I think there you go. So yeah, I guess tell us a bit about yourself.
So I think
the renovation.
You didn't have your paper there, whatever. You covered a lot of it. I was born and raised in Canada, St. Catharines, Ontario, and I went to Western for my undergrad and worked at a newspaper in Grimsby, Ontario for a year. And then I ended up in the States. I went to Syracuse University and did a graduate degree, and then ended up in the New York City area working in TV news. And so that was sort of what brought me to the US, and I stayed. I came back briefly for a couple of years and worked for Global Television in Toronto, but New York is, hard to quit. So I came back again. In around 2008, I ended up one of the great recession layoffs my television show was working on for Business Week got canceled. And I started writing for myself. I started ghostwriting people's books, doing some articles, and that's basically been my business for the past, 12, 13 years. So that's it in a nutshell, I guess.
Yeah, it sounds like you learned how to adapt and pivot long before this pandemic hit us, and for many of us to do it. So
yeah,
good for you.
Yeah.
So I guess, so now you do some writing. You mentioned earlier that you did some for Vanity Fair, I believe, and you talk a bit about what life is like in the Hamptons in some way, and tell us a bit about that and how that ties in. And there's some, some connections to your life and what you went through in regards to your renovation.
Sure. So, so I do articles for recently for Vanity Fair Hive online, talking about just the, bad behavior of the really ultra rich out here in the Hamptons, which is where my house is, in a little hamlet, unknown hamlet called Springs. Although the New York Times just wrote about it as the Hamptons party's moving to Springs. So that low key secret is out. But what's interesting, when I wrote about my kitchen renovation, it was for Curbed, and they talk a lot about renovations and rooms and houses and whatever. But for Vanity Fair, what's been interesting is all these people who came from New York City to their second homes, and those who didn't have a second home immediately bought second homes in the market. There's nothing left to buy out here, and the prices have just gone crazy. And what happened is all these idle rich people sitting in their homes with nothing to do look around and realize they need a pool house. They need a new basement renovation. 25-year-old kids moved home, and so their houses are full. They need guest houses. I wrote a story about compounding, where they just bought up all the mansions in the area so the kids could have some. So the renovation situation here has always been fraught with, difficulties for people who can't just write any check, that I can get my kitchen renovated, but I have to wait in line, and I have to really plan, like get somebody on the line. If I don't do it in the winter, it's never happening, because by, February, even just any little thing, the rich people are coming back to get ready for the summer. And so it's got to be an off-season thing. So that factored heavily into my renovation, and just also knowing I'm not one of these people, people will call and don't ask how much things are, and they'll just write a check or show up with bricks of cash to hand over to somebody to get anything done. So I had to be a little more careful about the spending. So that kind of factors in. And the other tiny part of it is, I thought it was going to be an okay thing to work from home as a writer. Well, my entire kitchen was being torn up and renovated.
Well, that's a tough go for sure.
Yeah, pretty genius idea on my part.
Yeah, in hindsight. Well, I would say that there's a lot of parallels, I think, still within like our market. We're here in Edmonton, Alberta. And while it's not the Hamptons, and we're not the ultra rich, typically don't come here. I mean, there's a few out there, but that's not who we play with, at least. Not most often. And I think that most people need to be budget conscious. But the one parallel would be that right now, everybody seems to want to renovate. So I know it's been difficult for a lot of people to find a contractor to come and do the work. But even as a general contractor, I have difficulty with sub-trades being busy. And luckily, I have I'm loyal with my sub-trades. I use them repeatedly. And so we have good relationships. So they will find ways to schedule me in. But we're really seeing some supply chain issues that have become a challenge for us. So I think, I have certain, I guess, aces in my sleeve I can pull out every now and then when I need a favor or whatnot. But the average person trying to renovate their home, especially if they decide to be their own general contractor, I think there's some significant hurdles out there for them right now in this market, whether you're in the Hamptons and you're up against the ultra rich, so everybody wants to work for them. That's a bit different, but there's some parallels between just trying to get your project done. You can't get the countertop you want. You have to wait 3 weeks for your whatever trade to come and do the project, and it can really slow things down and become a challenge. So, I guess I'm laying the groundwork here for some of the things you need to consider when starting your renovation. So let's talk about more specifically your reno. And I'm going to just pull up a picture here of your kitchen beforehand. Bear with me. Okay, so click. It's coming. All right. So I guess what first inspired you to decide to go, you know what, it's time to do the reno? What was that straw that broke the camel's back for you?
So I got some very good advice from the real estate agent I used when I bought this house. She said, don't change anything for at least a year living in the house. And so I waited a couple of years to kind of figure out the flow of things. But that kitchen was nearly unusable. You can't really tell how tragic it was, but there was no room. The shelves were too small for even just a wine glass. There's 2 drawers there, as you can see. I forgot about that. It's like crazy. So I had forks and knives and a basket on the counter. And then there's really not a ton of counter space. So I had to put like one of those restaurant steel shelves in to stack stuff up in another corner, and that looked pretty messy. Oh, wow. And so I put a screened-in porch on at the same time. So that's so funny, that old deck sitting there. That had to go also, which was just, it was falling apart. So I thought I'll do it all at the same time. So the kitchen just was, I had to put things on the floor often if I was cooking, like pans on the floor. I ran out of space. And then the other thing, that was the first time I had a gas or a electric range, and I really wanted to go gas. So that sort of inspired me. And, just along the lines of what we were talking about, I'm a heavy researcher, and I got really sort of obsessed with looking around and how I wanted to do it, and kind of wanted to get all my pieces in place before I started. So that took time for me to kind of process how I was going to do it, save enough money to do it. And it was sort of a useless waste of space in many, many ways. So even that slot down there that you can see to the right of the stove, I had stuffed with plastic bags. Like there was really nothing else that was good for.
Yeah, that looks like then that must have not been a custom kitchen when somebody originally built it, because you clearly could have designed a cabinet to fit that space or made some use of it, right? So this is, that's, there's enough reasons why there's a tipping point into wanting a new kitchen. I can see that. It doesn't look terrible, but I can see there's some serious pinch points when it comes to storage and whatnot. So you decided it's time to do the reno. Okay, so what was your first step? How did you come up with the design? And I know that you did have a general contractor, but how did the design side of things work for you? Because I know you do a ton of research, and that's one challenge I see out there. Like with our clients, we do what we call a design agreement. So we'll bring in a third-party interior designer to help design the aesthetics of the space. We often have kitchen designers that will help with the actual layout of the kitchen or the space itself. And through that process, we'll ask the client to put together, Pinterest boards or inspiration albums for us. And when they start researching, I can see them often get overwhelmed because there's so many options out there now. And I've seen a lot of clients get really thrown off by that and being unsure about how to proceed. And I guess for you as a researcher, I think you probably have the skill set to be able to kind of navigate through that a bit more clearly. But how did your process start, and how did you get to your end design ultimately?
Yeah, so I took a couple of wrong roads, and a couple of things worked in my favor. So yeah, I'm a question asker, and I'm surrounded by people who have renovated their kitchen because they have a lot of money and they have beautiful big homes. So I was able to really grill people on what they did, what they liked, what they didn't like. Why would you get this? Why would you do that? And then tap into some of their resources for help. And one thing if I think of what was sort of my starting point was these tile floors that ultimately I loved and turned out to be a problem, which we can talk about in a bit. But I started with the tile floor, and everything else had to follow that tile floor. So that became like a piece of, something or other that I carried around with me all the time. I knew I wanted an island, and I knew I wanted the Viking. That's the floor. Yeah, the Viking range. So my first step was a friend of mine said, I went to this kitchen company, and they do everything for you, and they guarantee being finished in 3 weeks. And it was about an hour and a half outside of where I am, which is the town of East Hampton, which is very expensive. And I thought, oh, this makes sense. I'm going to go kind of down into the middle of Long Island, and maybe it'll be a better price. So I met with this guy, and everything was sort of one-stop shopping. And by this point, I had not only my floor tile, I knew I wanted this matte black Kohler faucet. I knew I wanted the Franca 60/40 sink. And, there were, I knew I wanted these brass handles for the cabinetry. So I knew I wanted all these things. And then I went to this first place, and he gets designs. And in order to see the designs, you pay something like $1,500. And then the contract comes, and the price, I was like, okay, that seems higher, but seems okay. But then as I looked, it wasn't covering all of these things I had already sort of decided on my own that I wanted. And it was like a Kohler-like sink. And I realized, I was pretty obsessive about what I wanted. And so I said, this isn't going to work. I don't think I can do this. Now, two things from there. He did figure out how to put a giant island in, and just suggested I move that sliding glass door over. Two things I didn't think, I never would have thought of the sliding glass door. So while it was a waste of $1,500, I could just see, he also insisted I wanted white cabinetry. And I didn't. I knew the one thing I didn't want was white cabinetry. So that was step number one. Second step, I went to this other kitchen design place that was much more modern and chic and glossy. And to get that design, I had to pay up front before I even knew what the cost of these Italian imported cabinets were. And they were in New York City, so their workforce was supposedly going to come out here and work. And that, again, also was like, that's not a good idea. I felt, hesitant from my first misstep. So I just went into, I knew a contractor who had done a few things in my house. And then I went into just the hardware lumber store in town, and they had an actual kitchen designer. So I managed that part of it myself. And she designed, her name was Corey, Riverhead Builders, designed this kitchen. And she spent a lot of time going through what I wanted. And so then I went to the contractor with the plans and all my pieces. And what he was fine with, super nice guy, was unsourcing everything myself. So I paid for my cabinetry myself and the countertops, and my floors were coming in, my lights and the hardware, which were high ticket items. I waited till they went on sale and, was able to source those. So ordered, my sink was sitting in the basement and the faucet. So with very few exceptions, that's sort of how we managed the plan. And he was totally fine with that. So he sourced the labor, and a few little things here and there, like the drywall, the materials, but I went to the tile store. I picked out the paint color. I bought the, grout kind of thing. And so that was sort of the way that worked out. I don't know if that's typical, but.
I would say it's not. Well, it depends. It's probably typical for smaller contracting companies, one guy and a helper, and they're usually a lot more flexible at that point. I know for us, like our system's a bit different. We do try to get people engaged in the design process with us, and we do try to supply everything. And I do that mostly because then I find I have more control over the execution of the project and the timeline, and it really can tighten things up a lot. So I see the value in it. We've developed a system to make things, move along quickly. And, it sounds like your process, well, you ultimately got what you wanted, might have been quite time consuming and required you to run around a lot. So we try to help out a lot at the front end in the design process to be bringing samples out. And basically the way it works for us is we'll get the design package made by a designer, all the selections, and then we'll send that out to our vendors and have multiple vendors, depending on what the product is. And sometimes I'll know the right vendor for the right product too, and then they'll quote us and what it would cost. And we then put together a proposal for the client based on what we think is, the best way to do it. Might not always be using the cheapest vendor or supplier, but someone who has the skill set to handle it, especially if it becomes technical, right? So that's how we would do it. But ultimately, I'm glad you got what you wanted in the end. It sounds like maybe a bit of running around there, but the end result certainly speaks to you did a great job. So well done.
Thank you.
It's funny. You mentioned a joke you'd written earlier, and I'm going to bring it up now, which I was going to tie it into the intro, but there you go. So you joke that decades of pent-up indifference to many things revealed itself during your renovation, which you became obsessed about the details and got very specific about what you wanted. So how was that? How did that come about? I mean, was it through the research and seeing all your options out there, or you just loved so many different aspects, and how could you pull it together to work well in the same design? Or
so that's from my book Zenbender. It's called a decade-long quest to fix everything that was never broken, which I was writing while the renovation was going on. So I made that comment. So I never really thought, always thought of myself as a very go with the flow person, not really picky. Where do you want to go for dinner? I don't care. Let's go here. Back in the days when people were going out for dinner more regularly before the pandemic. And then I think after that first place that I showed up to do the kitchen, where they were making all these suggestions, I think it made me realize that's not for me, because I have all the ideas in my head. I know exactly what I want, and so I became super obsessed like that the floor alone. I mean, I agonized over that floor, and gray cabinetry, I couldn't land the right color to go with that floor. And then those countertops aren't actually pure white. They're just there's a creaminess to them because there was a creaminess to the floor, and I knew I didn't want to go super modern, but I wanted some modern. And then when I discovered this matte black concept I was like, I got to have that with just a little, texture to it. So I didn't know I had so much, obsession in me. And so I'm like, hey, it all came out in that, every single detail. I mean, I can tell you why I settled on every single detail in that kitchen. I knew I wanted some natural wood in there. Those shelves ended up being a bit of a hiccup, and the floor was a hiccup, but installing it anyway. But I think that was it. Once I started having someone say, no, you definitely want white, cabinetry and you want,
Mhm.
I think there are some things I don't want to have to make decisions on, but I think I realized, oh no, I've saved for years for this kitchen. I'm going to
Yeah.
decide every teeny detail.
Absolutely. I would say, like, I know that for us, as we try to guide our clients and steer them through, there's certain choices that have to be made that we try to help out with some of the choices, but they're typically about what will perform best, or, adhering to best practice in some way based on the install, or maybe, they're interested in a configuration. I mean, here you have a subway tile backsplash, and there's a lot of grout in when you get into a mosaic or subway tile backsplash. There's a lot of grout there. So if someone is a heavy pasta cooker, or they do a lot of deep frying, I tend to warn them, be careful with that grout. You'll have to make sure that, I mean, the grout all comes sealed now, but we might want to take some extra care to make sure that you don't end up with pink grout because your pasta sauce has splashed all over it, right? So we'll help try to steer the client through some choices, but like, never do we push them into a corner and say, you need to use this product. Because one thing I've learned in my years in this industry is that all that really matters at the end of the project is the client is happy with what we've built. And man, they have to be engaged, and you have to pull out of them the things that they love, and they might not even know what it is sometimes, and they can get lost in that myriad of the internet that's full of a zillion options. But you have to pull them back and ground them and help them get what they want. And I think that for someone, I guess I would say, who you don't specialize in kitchen design, you've done a great job. I mean, if I look at this thing in a practical manner, lots of good pull-out storage. The island's a nice big worktop, adds a ton of workspace for you. Aesthetically, it's beautiful. I do like the floating shelves, and I'll share the picture of the install, your brackets. I can see why that was a problem to install them. And definitely getting the sizing right matters too in that relation. So anyways, again, good job on the design.
Thank you.
If it's up writing, let me know and we can get you into some kitchen projects here. Let's talk about Zenbender for a second. I wanted to get into this off the top, and I kind of stumbled a bit there. So tell me a bit about the book. I've read a bit of this, I guess, synopsis or whatnot of the book, but tell me a bit about it, because it sounds really interesting. And I know, like we talked about earlier, I'm not the key demographic for who you're writing the book for, but I think I'm interested in checking it out for sure. So tell us a bit about it.
Yeah, thanks. It's sort of a humorous look at all these things that we do in terms of the wellness industry to constantly try to fix what's technically, I ultimately decided was not broken. So it was this right after I got laid off in 2008, sort of trying to scramble to figure out what I was going to do. And I started writing, but I was always very stressed out. So I would go to Venice Beach, California for a few months every year in the winter. This was pre-house, before I bought this house. And so, I would try a Reiki and acupuncture and clairvoyance and all these crazy things. So it was sort of a really attempted, Marie Kondo was a big thing, attempt at humor of kind of going through all these things and what I experienced and laughing about it and realizing in the end, you're like Dorothy with the red shoes. You had it in you all along. So that was the book. I went on what I called my 10-year Zenbender. And right. And I was really hustling writing that in the throes of this kitchen renovation. And I remember that, sometimes the contractor, they schedule multiple things. And I used to say that the days they didn't show up were louder than the days they did, because I would be like, where is this guy? I mean, squatting at the bottom of the stairs, making coffee in my living room and eating potato chips for breakfast. So that's sort of why the story of the book and the kitchen have a little intersection. Yeah.
Nice. Well, thanks for sharing. Let's talk a bit about the scheduling side of things then. So you worked from home throughout this process, and I know for our clients, often they'll ask us, can we stay in the house while you renovate it? And it really depends on the scale of the project and how big the scope is. But one thing I do see many clients, I guess, I don't know if I call it a mistake, but they'll often, I guess, they'll expect themselves to be able to handle living through the reno in a way that they think they would do better. And I've seen a lot of them struggle. And by the end, and we're good. Like we're we run tight timelines. We're really good about dust and noise protection, and we're really good about not damaging surfaces that aren't being renovated. Like, we take a lot of extra care, and we're one of the really good guys when it comes to this, but it still sucks to live through a reno. And I can only imagine if you're living through it when an amateur is doing your job, or somebody who hasn't taken the care to make sure that your whole house doesn't get dust bombed when they renovate your kitchen, right? So I try to get the clients to move out whenever they can, if they can afford it, or if that's a possibility, because in the end, I think they really appreciate coming back to their new space, and they haven't had to suffer through, the 2-3 months of renovation that went on in the home. So I guess on your end, I would imagine you didn't have the availability to go live elsewhere, or was it more for you to help supervise the project, or what was, like, how did you decide to live through it?
So a little bit of both. And, I think I knew I wanted to be around to check on things. And I think that's just to make sure it was going where I wanted to go. And I did have some escape into the city for a couple of days a week here and there. So that was helpful into New York City. But the thing that, seemed like it would be okay and then wasn't, it all came down to that floor. So the floor, I said, go ahead and tear this thing up early. Moved the fridge into the living room, and I'm also by myself. So I think that maybe helps a little bit. I knew nobody's out here in the winter. I knew if I had to go stay at someone else's house, I could. I knew I could go in the city and escape, but I'm also just one person. So it felt like it made it a little bit easier. I could go work in the library if I needed to. So this floor, I ordered these tiles based on a sample that they sent to me. And so then I said to the contractor, look, I want that. We're going to heat that floor underneath. And it's a complicated, apparently, process of some sort of, now I can't remember the name, the way, dry buffing or wet buffing, one of those things with these concrete tiles, metal. And you almost take a strip off and take the glean off, and then they treat it with a sealant, and they're supposed to look a little natural and not imperfect.
Right.
But when I remember vividly, the contractor, he did the demo. So there's no kitchen. And I'm going to say this was late October, early November. Right. So we tear the floor up, and then he and I were just taking a look at these tiles, and I'm like, oh my God, these aren't the sample, because they deliver this big flat of tiles to the house. And he's like, oh my God, and they're all different. And we're ripping them out of the box like, what the heck? These are shiny. And, I had gotten these chalky color tiles. And so it was a 5-alarm, moment. And I think the other thing, I had been back and forth to the tile store in town, and I would say, and I talked to designers since, I would never, ever again order tiles from, this was California, but you need to sit and look at them and make sure they're the same. In my opinion, these were so dramatically different than the original, and everything was kind of hyper based on these tiles. So then, and I can't remember if we had just sort of started and then we realized they didn't match. So then they tried to put the kind of least matchy ones under where cabinets would go. And there was just so much debacle surrounding that. So then we get them in, and he's working on this wet sanding process, which he had to bring in some specialists to do because it sounded standard. But even the wonderfully kind people at the tile store in town were like, we never even heard of that. So I was back and forth with the company, and I'm like, none of this matches. And she said, they even out when you wet sand them or whatever. Yeah. But they didn't totally. And the problem was, we had dropped electricity below that floor. So
that complicates it for sure. Yeah.
So there was no tearing that up. And then we learned the company that makes the cabinetry, which is actually a Canadian company, and I love them. Morales, I think it's Cuisine Morales or something like that. Fantastic stuff. I think they're out of Montreal. The order, because I guess it's called semi-custom, like they don't up price to make them custom match, and then some are just standard, was a 12 weeks, not 6 weeks. And that
Mm.
was, everybody was like, whoa, we didn't know that. You know, the kitchen designer didn't know that. I didn't know that. So I was sitting with a nice floor and nothing else for an extra 6 or 8 weeks, which made the living at home. I mean, it was quiet. It didn't matter. And I had the porch put on the back of the house, the screen-in porch. So they at least had that to work on, and they were cool about that. But none of us really saw that coming either. So the floor, and then the floor just became like such a stress point. And the company actually refunded the full cost of the tiles.
Oh,
so
wow.
that was $3,000 or $4,000, and they gave it back because we couldn't fix it at that point because of the electricity. And so
that's, well, good for you. I mean, that's not something that you see happen very often. That's that's a good vendor, right? If they'll stand behind it to that extent.
Yeah.
That, or they're terrified that a journalist and writer.
I always wonder, they Google me. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess one question for you: how much of that book was written while laying on that heated floor?
I used to say that I would sleep on that floor. It's so warm. Yeah. It was, that year was, written. I didn't even go in the kitchen with just the floor. I mean, I would look, but there's nothing you could do in there. So it was just a floor and a fridge in the living room.
Yeah. Well, you know what? It's funny. Those kind of things sometimes, things pop up every now and then. We're going through an issue right now in a project where the week it's supposed to be installed, I'm told by one of my suppliers that the countertop's not available, right? And this has already been a substitution once because the first tops we couldn't get. So it's kind of last minute. And I was writing the client this morning saying, look, like, this is very frustrating. I understand it is for me too. But sometimes there's a silver lining in these last minute changes. So let's just try to stay positive and let's push through it. We'll find you a solution. And I guess for you, ultimately, although I'm sure it was super painful, I mean, you got $4,000 or $5,000 back on it, which kind of helps with your budget and offsets some other things too, right? So, I guess I'm just one of those guys. I try to always look on the positive side of things, even when things get really tough. I start scratching to the surface. What's good about this? Something has to be good about it. So, every now and then that'll reassure a client. And sure enough, something will come out of it where, wow, we'd love this substitution we made even more than what we originally thought we'd wanted. And that can sometimes be, the blessing in disguise there. So.
Yeah. And I think ultimately, once everything was in the kitchen, only I noticed those couple of tiles that might have popped differently than the original. I still love the floor. So
yeah. That's a cement caustic tile?
Yeah.
Yeah. We have that in our front entry. And we didn't use any special sealer on it. My wife's from Peru. And so that cement tile is everywhere down there. And we just love how it looks as it gets dirtied and scuffed. It's really soft and quite porous. And, we hit it with a cleaner every now and then. But we love the character that gets added to it. So probably a couple discolored tiles over the years you won't notice as much, because even with the best of sealants, I'm sure it'll eventually show some wear. All right. What else can we talk about here? So how about, selecting your contractor? You had already worked with this person before, and that's how you knew of them, and you just reached out and said, hey, do you do kitchens? How did that process go?
Yeah. I did just 2 small things before this. I put a window in the front of the house. There wasn't one looking out the living room, and it felt very much like a bunker because the door was there and there was no window. So it was, I feel like it was an $800 job or something small. He just cut this window in. And then there was a fireplace that just was the opening. And so I went to the tile store and he did tile. And my neighbor actually had a large wood, perfect sized mantle. And she's an artist, and she suggested painting it this kind of chrome color. And so he did that for me. So, and he's a local guy that everybody's worked with, and very nice. And so he did my neighbor's, some of the stuff in her house. And so I just checked in with him, super nice guy, and went for it. And there was no, which I know people were like, oh, you shouldn't do this. There was no detailed cost contract thing.
Gotcha.
So I knew what I was paying for all the materials because I was buying them all. And then there was some approximate, pricing and things. And it was a pretty crazy way to do it. And it did come in a little more than I had expected. But it was sort of a mishmash because I think he kind of estimated what the price of the kitchen would be. And then the porch was the wild card. So that kind of got all mushed in together. It's a beautiful cedar screen and porch. And then things like electrical, you know, there were these weird variables about the floor and you know, so that is not the greatest way to do it. I acknowledge that 100%. But at that point I had been down through, like I said, the 2 other wrong roads and I'm out here and I'm coming up on October, November. And I thought, geez, I'd have to wait a whole nother 12 months to go. So I just sort of trusted that it would get done and it did. So,
yeah, I mean, definitely, you know, I think you having known the person already and that kind of set some level of trust there. A risky way to do it if you were going with somebody you'd never met before. Yeah. And, you know, when we get into the unknowns for pricing, we call those allowances. And then we basically try to set a realistic allowance. And then if it goes beyond, well, that's a change order. If it comes in less, that's a credit back to the client, right? So we try to avoid starting jobs in that way because it can get stressful for the client. I always use a fixed price contract. So the client knows exactly what it's going to cost unless there's a variation from scope. And that more so is to avoid that client getting stressed about how much is this going to add up to. They already know when we sign on the dotted line how much it's going to cost. Aside from, you know, you should have some contingencies because there'll be a surprise somewhere, which I'm sure you ran into somewhere along the line. And, you know, every house has its secrets and we usually find them during the demo process. But yeah, it's interesting, you know, I mean, most of our clients come from referrals from past clients or people who have heard of us and understand what we bring to the table. And we do get some jobs where people just go, hey, Paul, can you just do the project? We know we can trust you. And we do it. Where some clients are like, hey, I'm interviewing 4 other contractors. Do you want to submit a bid against these guys to win the project? And those ones, you know, generally I don't get incredibly competitive about it and really want to fight for a job. It's, you know, I guess one of those things, I want to love the client as much as I want them to love the fact they've chosen us. So that's who we look for. But anyways, that's not the point here. All right. So what would you say was your favorite phase of the project? So by this, I mean, was it the design stage? Was it demolition? Was it getting through the rough-in changes, which is usually not everybody's favorite, or then into finishing? It's just one of those things. I geek out a little bit on this kind of stuff sometimes as to what makes people tick. So what do you think? What did you enjoy most?
You know, I think obviously when it was finished, I liked it the most because it was a long time. I liked when I called it my kitchen in the bag. I liked when I had all the pieces of the puzzle decided. You know, I knew, and I would sort of like set it out in different light and stare at it to make sure. Literally, I think the only thing I did on the fly was the paint color above the tile. And, you know, it wasn't totally on the fly, but I didn't decide that ahead of time. Or maybe, yeah, no, I did decide that till after demo. But everything else I went into with a complete, you know, decision made. And I like that. I liked when I you know, was checking with the cabinetry and the, you know, countertops and you could kind of see that it all went nicely together. You know, I think that's just my personality too. So what I didn't like was when there were just 2 or 3 small things that hadn't been planned for. The shelves in the corner. I don't know what I was thinking, and we didn't talk about it. And all of a sudden the contractor and I were like, what's going on in the corner there, you know, with the shelf? When are we doing the shelves? And he's like, oh, they didn't come from the kitchen place. And I'm like, no, we got to make those, I guess. And then he scrambled and he was like, okay, we didn't order these brackets. It was one of these tiny things we really didn't talk about. He's like, well, what do you want there? And I had really specific, you know, I wanted this oak color. And I knew how I wanted them to look. And he said, well, we got to make them, they're like hollow and built in to go on. It's the only way. And so he and I were sort of like, okay, they were drawn into the drawing to an extent by the kitchen designer, but that was not an order with the cabinetry. So it was funny, you know, we had a laugh about it. At least there was that. But in the end, they didn't fit my wine glasses. I had to buy shorter wine glasses. And that was just totally like him and I winging it, like, how far should they be from the top, and he knew I was going to be like, everything had to be even. And he's like, well, let's make sure you want how far from the top, how far from the bottom. And we're kind of Googling what's the space. So that was a real wing it moment for sure. And I do love them though. They came out great. They
look great. They look super challenging to install based on your mounting brackets right there because of the overlap on the inside corner there. No doubt. But yeah, we do a lot of floating shelves. So I can tell you a lot more goes into them than anybody would imagine, especially if you light them. Like we'll often put lighting within them. So then you have to get the wire pulled to the right spot exactly. And the shelf goes in generally after tile. So you get that wrong. And now you're redoing some tile before you can put your shelf back up. But
there's lighting under the bottom one. Those was the things we hadn't really talked about. Will there be lighting and what's going to go? And it was a total, I was like, I don't know. Don't you just get wood and put it up? And he's like, no. So that was something, but they did a really nice job. But then, he had to bring in a different guy who does the stain and a different guy to build the shelf and, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, in the end, I think we budget on average for every shelf about $500. And people are like, $500 for a shelf? How could that be? And it's like, man, do you know how much goes into making sure these things fit? They're in the right place. Yeah. They look like they were designed to be there, and to get the lighting right, because not just getting lighting to the shelf. You want to make sure that everything is drilled out so that, it's all symmetrically installed. And anyways, there's a lot that goes into these things. So I can relate for sure to that. Okay. So I always ask because I have some clients in the last couple of years that have loved the demolition stage, and they've come and asked, can I smash a couple walls, please? Yeah. So we get in there and give them a sledgehammer, some safety glasses, and have at her. Usually I'll take a video and I'll put it on social media after too, because it's kind of a good laugh. We'll do a little slow-mo video of a client knocking a wall down, which is a lot of fun for everybody. And I think there's some therapy in there for them too, especially when it's a wall that they've wanted removed for a decade and they finally get to have the view from their kitchen that they always wanted, or whatever that might be. So, but okay, tell you what we can do. I'm gonna show some of your photos here, and we'll just talk a bit about them as we go through.
Sure.
Bear with me. Okay, so there it is, the end result. So you have a gas stove. So for your gas range, or for the range hood, did you have to change your venting because of, yeah?
Yeah. So that was another funny story. So I dreamed about that Viking range forever, and then realized there's got to be a hood that goes along with the power of a commercial range. And so that I had unexpected cost, but because it's much, much more expensive. And then he had to get, like, I guess it's an HVAC guy to come in and reroute there is up above there. There's, the pipe. Yeah. And then it goes over the top of the kitchen and out the back. So that was a little tricky. It's a very high ceiling. And then this porch was being put on the back. So it was a little tricky, but not so much. So I needed to have gas installed, propane, because I don't get gas to the house. It's so I had a tank that had to be put in, and then these last things that go in are the appliance. And so or in this case, and so it was funny because I was talking to my dad, and I'm like, I think they left the plastic on the range. He goes, you can't stop cooking. You can't, it's going to melt. And I was like, oh, you think so? And so then I had to pause on that. And then, so that was like a while before they could come back and pull that thing out because it's super heavy. And then I said, well, I'll turn on the vent, and all the cupboards blew open because they hadn't actually put the connecting. So then I was like, oh my God. I called the guy. I'm like, okay, I'm really, really desperate to use this thing. Can you finish this job? So it was like, that was really the long goodbye, was that range at the end, because It took some time. And the other delay, like the floor wasn't really a delay. The cabinets were delayed. But the other thing was the countertop. They called me while I was on a work trip in Miami, and they said, "You're not going to believe this, but this has never happened. But that thing cracked. It's good we found out now, because there was obviously a faulty piece and whatever."
Mhm.
And there was a person I was working with, and she had heard the other side of the conversation and said, "Did somebody die?" I'm like, basically my countertop is still, because it was like, I was really, you're getting down to that last minute where,
Yeah.
you can't take it. So then all these little hiccups with the range were delayed. I remember when the guy came to install the propane too, I said, "This is literally like the greatest day of my life." And he's like, "Well, that's sad." Because he really wanted that range. So it really killed me just to wait 48 hours more after all the cupboards blew open. But the hood was an important thing. So yeah, that's a long-winded story about that range.
Yeah. Well, I think, you talk about that pressure buildup at the end because of you wanting that to be done so badly. And that's a big part of what I mentioned earlier about clients choosing to live through the renovation. We see them by the end, they just want their space back and to be done, and stop washing dishes in a bathtub, stop eating microwave dinners, and just have to have some privacy back, right? So anyways, we got a couple of comments here and questions. So Alyssa Fessick, she's saying, "Well, there's so many decisions to make. Holy smokes." Yeah, there definitely is. I think it surprises a lot of people for sure. Says, "Your book sounds really great. I'm a personal development and wellness junkie too." Alicia says, "The wine glasses look great. Is there anything you would change in design if you had your time back?"
So generally, I would say no. I love everything about it, but were, I guess, two small things. The contractor said, "Where do you want the faucet to go?" And so that sink is a 60-40 split, but he's like, "You can have it at the center, you can have it where the sink splits." And I thought, oh, the center is a really good idea. I would center that faucet. So it was centered. It was a bad decision. And when my sister just did her kitchen and got the same sink, I said, "Don't center the faucet, put it on the sink split," because it's very hard to get water now into, and it might just be that is sort of a tricky faucet, but it should be along that line so you can more easily fill that sink with water. It actually barely makes it to the other sink. And then the only other thing that drives me a little nuts is the space between the back wall behind the sink and the sink is small. Like it's not much space. So it gets very wet, so I worry I did have them put like silicone, the color of the grout down, and I would do that thicker even though you could see it, because I just worry it like is soaking a little bit into the grout. And I don't know how that could have been done differently, because I don't think there's much room toward the front. I don't know that anything was done differently, but I'm 5'2", so I didn't want any deeper reach over for that sink. That was part of the decision. I guess the only other thing is I went with a very inexpensive fridge, which in this photo looks like it has a dent, and it probably does. I don't love the fridge so much. It's fine and it fit, and there weren't a lot of options. I had one choice on dishwasher, because I did as you can see there beside the fridge is the dishwasher with the cabinetry over top. There was really only one model. I might have gone a little fancier on the fridge, and I suppose that's a changeable thing. But I was
to get your height and width to match, you should be good. I mean, it's pretty tight within the cabinet there for sure, but
yeah.
We often tell our clients, look, the appliance is either then spec to fit the opening in the cabinet, or we design the cabinet around your appliance, right? So really depends on you and how important your appliances are. Usually I tell my clients to pick their appliance group early, and then we design our cabinets around them.
Yeah, that first guy said to me, pick your appliances and treat your sink like an appliance. So that was a good tip I did that day, like figured that all out. And I think it's a pretty standard size fridge, and there wasn't a lot of wiggle room. So in order to make room for the 6 burners and the island, which I was pretty determined, everything else there wasn't a lot of option. Like there was no way to do a larger fridge at all. So if there's another kind of different model someday, I could upgrade that. The one thing I am glad I didn't do, and it was actually my mother who had said, don't do it. There were all these pictures on Pinterest at the time of black grout. And I thought, oh, I'm going to do black grout. That looks so sharp. But she was really like, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. And I think it was great because, really there could only be so many kind of showstoppers, and the floor was already pretty dramatic.
Mm-hmm.
And the black cabinets were sort of the next level. The tile isn't flat and has some texture to it, and that was enough. I think it would have been way too much to have the black. So I didn't go white. It's a very light gray.
Mm-hmm. I can see a little bit of contrast there. I'm glad you didn't go with the dark route too. And I like the look of it depending on what tile is used, but we did it a couple of years ago for a client who did a subway tile. But it was like a hand-honed looking tile, so none of the edges were really nice and straight. And the problem is when we put that dark charcoal grout in with that white backsplash tile, is the grout line became so pronounced, and it showed the variation in grout line thickness. And it almost created this kind of dizzying effect that made you look like something was wrong, but you can't figure out what. And so I'm not a big fan of it. The look can be nice, but you really have to be prepared to deal with the fact that it'll point out any deficiency in the tile install. But anyhow,
yeah.
All right. Here's our shelves. Yes, I like the kind of goldish, it looks like gold hardware.
So that's brass from Rejuvenation, and that was another early decision. I really, really wanted that. And it was expensive. It was more than the refrigerator, and I waited till there was a big sale and whatever. So the funny story there, so they're big decisions, do you go with smaller pulls on the drawers, wide pulls? And I think they're all exactly the same size, even the dishwasher, though it is a little bit of an optical illusion here. On the picture, I think they look wider, but I think I got all of them the same size. And the funny thing, so the contractor said, where do you want these? What do we do? And I said, well, what are the options, and we decided, I believe we went 1.5 inches up, 1.5 inches in on the cupboards, and centered on the drawers. The one exception, and we really spent time discussing it. The one exception, there is a pantry in the other corner there. And you might not even, there, that's it. So yeah. So see those pulls, we decided that's my kitchen in the bag I put in the article. We decided those pulls should go more at eye level because of my height. And so he and I really thought this through and had a long discussion. Then he explained to the guys who were doing the work, and I'm in my office working, and they always had music on. I never said anything, and you can hear them. Whatever they use makes a noise to put these handles on, and all of a sudden the noise stops, and the music stops, and they step outside onto the porch, and I'm like, uh-oh, and I go out there, and I'm like, they put the pulls for the pantry way up high. They put them 1.5 inches and 1.5 inches like everything else. And it's just like, we literally just discussed this. And then Gino's the contractor. Gino went over it with you, and he very nicely offered to replace all 3 of those doors, which are very expensive. And I said, it's fine. It is the one thing I definitely joke with him. Like, I think of you every time I open the pantry. I have to reach up to get it. So that was funny, but I love those pulls. The brass are beautiful.
Yeah, they certainly are. And it's funny, because every now and then we run into these kind of challenges too, where something was done in a manner that's not exactly what the client wanted. And at that point, you're really, as the contractor, what do you do, right? Yeah, I just made a mistake on my handle install. I'm looking at $1,000 in new doors. All right. At that point, you have to offer it, right? It's your mistake. And, lucky for you, you're an understanding client. Well, you know what? I can live with this. Good on you. right? Yeah. I've been the contractor where the client's not been okay with it. And I've been, and I've also had some really graceful clients that in the end go, you know what, it's not a big deal. But fortunately for us, it doesn't happen very often. But anyhow. All right. So let's see here. I think we've been through most of these picks now. We talked about your sink, kitchen in a bag. So speaking of kitchen in the bag, anybody who wants to read the article that Stephanie wrote, we found it on Curbed. And maybe what I'll do is we'll post it in the comments here once it goes onto YouTube here later, and you can find the link to go find the article and check it out. And then I would say look Stephanie up, check out what she does, maybe read her book. I'm going to check it out. Well, you get your review from a contractor on.
I'll do it on Amazon. Yeah. We need the reviews.
There you go. All right. I'm just going to put some information up here. Bear with me for a second. Okay. So anybody who wants to find Stephanie, I'm going to show you how to find her. And we just put basically your social media stuff on here for you. So there you go. Celebrity ghostwriter and journalist. So let's see, what time is it? 1:56. We got a couple of minutes. What does this mean, celebrity ghostwriter?
So most people who are of note don't write their own book. So people like me write it for them.
Okay.
And most times my name doesn't appear anywhere around or on the book, but on occasion it does. So I wrote the book for the first female coach of the NFL. My name is on her book as a with, suggesting we work together. Some people want that, some people don't. Mm-hmm. And so that's a whole business. Ghostwriting for people who have something to say but don't write.
All right. Well, that might just be me one day. Not the writing side of it, needing the services of the ghostwriter. But yeah, thanks so much for coming on the show. I know it's a little bit outside of the ordinary for you and for me too. It's a bit of a different show for us, but I think you lived through a lot of the challenges and choices and, and also, I guess, the benefit of it having worked out well. I mean, that's great. You've lived through a lot of what our clients or anybody at home is considering doing their own project. They will face a lot of the challenges you did. And I'm really happy for you that it turned out well. It's a beautiful space. And, great article. It really was something that helped outline, the tips on, what to consider, what to be careful of. And there's some good advice in there. So well written. And yeah, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, for sure. And so we'll post some links for you here in the comments afterwards. And I guess anybody who wants to track me down, well, there you go. Paul from Contractor Renovations. I'm the host of the Art of Renovation Live. This show has been a kitchen reno story, the good, the bad, and the beautiful. And thankfully for you, Stephanie, it all turned out to be beautiful. And aside from a few delays, I think it went well. So thanks for sharing. Thanks for tuning in, anybody who watched. And take care. We'll talk again soon.
Bye, Paul. Thanks.
Yep, bye-bye.